On this episode of Explore the IRL podcast, my guest is Laura Wilson, Executive Director of the Marine Resources Council. Today, we'll be discussing low-impact development and low-impact living and things you and communities can do to help restore this paradise. So come along and explore the Indian River Lagoon. So Laura, thanks so much and welcome to Explore the IRL podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Always happy to talk Lagoon.
It's a pleasure to get you back on. Obviously, we talked a few months ago. So
Yeah.
why don't we start a little bit? How have things settled in now that you've been at MRC for a while?
I'm feeling really good. I feel like I'm personally finding my feet underneath me. I think MRC as an organization is definitely taking strides forward in terms of fulfilling our mission, but also making a few tweaks for how we are advancing our mission as well. So I am extremely optimistic for what 2025 is going to hold for us.
Well, fantastic. I think it's great. I'm seeing more stuff out there. You're getting into
Good.
new things. And let's talk some about one of, I guess it's maybe a newer initiative, I'm not really sure, which is around low impact development. And then we can get into low impact living.
Yeah.
But what is low impact development?
Low impact development is all about really the site planning when developing land with the goal of keeping water that rains down on the land where it falls versus allowing it to run off and affect neighboring environments. And so it's the site planning and design that goes into the land development. And then you have the green infrastructure piece of it, which are the techniques that you employ. So some of it's engineered, some of it's nature-based, and it's really this amalgam of techniques for reducing runoff and reducing the nutrient pollution that enters the water systems.
And how is that different from how we're doing development now and how the water runs off, et cetera?
In the past, there hasn't been as much focus on where the water goes or how long it's retained or detained in an area. There has been advances with the stormwater bills and stormwater requirements that will definitely be kicking in the next couple of years that have a lot more attention on focusing on where water moves once it falls on land. Florida is very well known for our burps, our big ugly retention ponds. And that's really been the traditional way that we move water off of the land and into a retention pond that will eventually, usually, if they're a retention pond, stay, or a detention pond, move into another water system. But there hasn't really been a focus on how to clean that water or how to harvest that water so it has a better chance of infiltrating into the aquifer or being cleaned before it moves into a river or lagoon system.
And so these newer approaches essentially do more with the water to both control where it goes as well as how it's cleaned?
It does. So especially the engineered solutions, you have a lot more allowing water to permeate through the ground. So things like permeable pavements and asphalts that allow water to actually seep into the ground. And then you're going to get aquifer recharge, which is really important for our irrigation, for our drinking, and things like that. And then you have kind of either these hybrid or these green engineering, nature-based solutions is another word that you use, where you're moving water through native plant gardens or buffer zones. So you're allowing the deep plant roots to actually pull out the nitrogens, pull out the phosphates to clean the water, and then also slowing that water down so it can infiltrate into the aquifers as well. So it's both.
Right. And I know a lot of our flow, I was watching some on a presentation the other night, talked about all of the flow going into, say, the lagoon. And obviously, some of it we see, but a lot of it's coming subterranean through
Yes.
the aquifer, correct?
Yep. So, I mean, depending on especially what sort of rocks you're on, if you're on coquina, I mean, that's an extremely porous subject. They're substrate. They're big pockets for air and for water to move between the shells. And so anything that soaks into the ground there is eventually going to flow out into the lagoon. Sands as well are very permeable. So a lot of the things that are soaking in will eventually get to the lagoon through the groundwater systems.
And I saw one of the presentations actually at your low impact development conference showed how to sort of rethink neighborhoods based on low impact development.
Mhm.
And I noticed how they laid out the houses maybe differently and then had these green areas or flow areas or things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There are a bunch of different ways that people are approaching this. So putting in bioswales. So we already use a lot of natural or engineered low points in landscapes that allow the water to collect. But I heard a really interesting fact the other day that things like St. Augustine turf, once you have an inch of water fall on it, it can't absorb anymore. So it's just going to run off like it was concrete. So rather than having turf within those bioswales, you put in your native plant gardens with deep roots allowing permeation. And so you can design neighborhoods with that in mind. You can also design it so that you are combining these kind of plant areas together so that you have longer landscape buffer zone gardens. Things like tree canopies as well, that trees themselves can stop 15 to 30% of water that rains down. One live oak can hold 10,000 gallons of water. So really looking at either building tree canopies between housing units or saying that for the amount of land that you develop, you have green space that's cohesion where you can build those tree canopies, where you can have a more larger patch of kind of native habitat for biodiversity as
Mhm.
well. So there are a couple of different ways that site planners are approaching this not disturbing or being more responsible how we develop the land.
Yeah, so there's one thought, which is how you build it out to begin with. But
Mhm.
obviously, we have a lot of development that's already occurred here.
Right.
And so, how do you revise what we have? Or do you have some examples of that?
I don't have examples of that, and, when I was very not that I'm not new here, but when I was very new here, I went to an event and I was talking to a developer, and we're talking about our upcoming low impact development that was happening that fall. And he was talking about how he really wanted information on redeveloping land, and I've brought that point up with many people, and it's just not something that we have great examples of yet. It hasn't been as um, I don't want to say enforced because we really don't have a whole lot of low impact development enforcement in legislatures and code yet, but it really hasn't been pushed as much as new land development and new site development. So I think that's a big gap that we need to push forward for how to redevelop land other than just paving over the
Hmm.
existing pavement to make it look nicer. Because there are definitely easier things to do, like native plant gardens, that still allow for a little bit of water filtration and water cleaning and water management. But I think that's somewhere that we really need to go moving forward. But I feel like we're a little bit more in our infancy in low development impact or low impact development building here than other areas.
Uh-huh.
So we're just now getting to the point of even new site development that's responsible and sustainable.
Yeah, and I'm thinking like I've seen some of the efforts, you've probably seen these as well, like where Canaveral put in that
Yeah.
rain garden, or we're
Mhm.
starting to see those little buffers along the
Yep.
streets and things that are native plants that can perhaps take more of the water. I've seen some maybe permeable streets as well
Mhm.
that people are beginning to look at. So hopefully we're seeing more of that. Now, one of the issues is, and I don't know how much you've looked at this, but how does this when a developer or even as we're reconfiguring things, is it more costly? Is there a lot of that? Or is it really, hey, we're just going to swap this out a bit and make it different?
I don't have solid numbers.
Hmm.
That's where I don't have all my information together yet for solid numbers on the cost comparisons. I'm working on getting those from developers and product suppliers. There are aspects that are a little bit more costly, like the site plan itself, just because developing sites for water retention, water storage, water cleaning is so very site specific that it's a very different process to design the layout versus the typical this many acres requires a this size retention pond, which is very much a cut and paste
Uh-huh.
engineering and development. So there is more time, which of course is more money on the front end for the development of the site. But in terms of overall, if you're doing low impact development, you should actually be able to develop more of the land, because if you're holding the water on the site through underwater cisterns and reservoirs and your native plants, then you don't actually require that retention pond. And so you can actually develop more of the land, which then brings back a higher value
Uh-huh.
of and more profits from the building and development side. So they're trade-offs.
Hmm.
And hopefully I'll have more solid numbers soon for
Well,
what
that
those
sounds
are.
great. Obviously, it's really pretty new here,
Hmm.
and so the other thing is, I think, as we've seen, the lagoon is a huge economic driver
Absolutely.
for this area, whether it's property values and others. So ultimately, if we're putting less into the lagoon,
Hmm.
we're going to see an increase in the value of property around here, the use of the lagoon, the beauty, the people who come to visit, all of
Right.
that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's the ecotourism, which, luckily the state sees a lot of value in. So we've actually gotten some financial benefits from that for preserving the lagoon and the region, because people come here for the water. And if you don't have clean, healthy water and ecosystems, people are going to stop coming here. So luckily, we have that as a financial driver that gives us the ability to have the resources to make impactful changes. But yeah, that's a huge thing. And one of the really interesting things to communicate with people is the idea that fresh water is a pollutant to the lagoon. It's such a delicate balance between salt water and fresh water that when you get millions of gallons of fresh water running off the land into the lagoon, that throws off that balance, and it's very negatively impactful. But usually, fresh water is the lifeline and something that we all need to survive. So to think of it as a pollutant is weird.
Right, and really the lagoon is brackish,
Hmm.
and so it's not completely salt water, which I
Right.
guess would be problematic, as well as completely fresh water coming in, so that balance is obviously
It does,
critical.
and it's what leads to this huge biodiversity that we talk about in the lagoon, is because we have this mix. We have saltwater tolerant and freshwater tolerant and brackish tolerant organisms that can all share this to lead to the 4,400 species we have in the lagoon.
Fantastic, and obviously you mentioned earlier low impact living.
Yes.
What is low impact living?
Low impact living is a new initiative from Marine Resources Council that takes low impact development from a land development code, legislature perspective, and then adds individual actions. So it's all about empowering individuals. And we have a couple of different pillars to it. We have an education, which is something that public education, which is something MRC has always done, but very much targeted to giving individual people, whether they're a homeowner, whether they are a renter, whether they are a kid, give them actionable items that they can do to make a positive impact, with this idea that little changes are going to add up to big changes. And if you empower somebody to make a little change, that hopefully they'll want to go on to make more of those. So there's a public education, um, and action items for small changes. There is a citizen empowerment section that comes with advocacy. So things like holding workshops to help people understand how they can advocate for their communities, for the lagoon, with their HOAs, with their political representatives in their city councils, or county commissions type of thing. So empowering them with messages to take forward. There's the low impact development. So the work continuing and really pushing to try to get low impact development in and then enforced in land development codes across municipalities and then legislature. We had success with pushing forward a revision of the stormwater regulations, which is all part of this where water goes after it rains. And then, kind of a little bit closer to home for us, MRC manages and owns multiple properties along the lagoon. So really working for those to be educational centers where we can showcase the principles of low impact development and low impact living with the rain gardens and the educational centers and the rain barrels. And we're getting ready to install a floating wetland, and do an experiment around that to show water quality changes. So some of these different things that people can do in their communities to make positive impacts.
So, can you discuss some of those specifics of what individuals can do?
Absolutely, it's what we've talked about with low impact development, but on a homeowner scale or a community scale. So things like thinking about the plants that you're putting in your yard. And we push a lot of native plants. They require less watering. They don't require fertilizer to be healthy since they're native to here, and they help pull the chemical pollutants out of the water that falls and runs off land. Things like being aware of fertilizer bans or the types of fertilizers that they're using. Most of the soils in this area are already high phosphate, so you don't need to add more phosphate to your lawns. And then using things like slow release nitrogens, if you do end up fertilizing. Um, you know, Little things, even the importance of picking up after a pet. And we're really lucky here in Brevard because we have the Sorrel funding. So understanding the septic to sewer transition or upgrades to bioseptic, and the funding you can get through those conversions. How to, things like talking with your landscape crew, talking with your HOA and what they're talking about with your landscape crew. We have a great example on our retention pond, since we're right off of US 1 here in Palm Bay, of a beautiful buffer zone. So a 3+ foot patch of plants between turf and our retention pond. And we have huge biodiversity of wading birds. We have a little alligator out there that the staff love, fish jumping all the time. And it's because we have this buffer zone that's allowing to slow the water and clean the water that runs off the land before it hits the pond. So little things that people can do. Rain barrels. We've been proponents of harvesting water that comes off the roof. So really little things that are not too expensive, are variations on things you're already doing in your home, but that can make a positive impact, especially when you think of them on a community scale.
Right. If you think about thousands and
Yeah.
tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people doing this,
Mhm.
incredible impact. Where can people go to your website to find more information about this or your presentations or things like that?
So I'd say definitely our website, lovetheirl.org, is a great place to start. We've been hosting a low impact development conference for 4 years now. So from that perspective, we have a lot of information, and then actually copies of all the presentations that have been given at those, if you want to get into the details of it. As part of the low impact living, we're really working on increasing kind of the infographics and resources that we can provide people. So we have resources pages, social media. We share a lot of it on that as well. You can sign up for our newsletter, which we are starting to put in kind of more of these tips and tricks every month. And then I think we're doing, as a community of organizations and citizens working on restoring the lagoon, I think we're doing a lot better job of sharing communications and collaborating. So sharing each other's messages is a big part of what we're doing, that we don't have to be the ones that start everything and be
Right.
that one voice, that we can echo other voices for impact.
And you're also up on social media as
Yeah.
well with Facebook and things like that.
So the big social media presence, and we'll start kind of putting more of the infographics and information that we collect there.
Yeah, I think it's really a great idea, this low impact living, because it as you said, it's simple things
Mhm.
that really don't take a lot. And you can go as big and deep as you want
Yeah.
into it, but you can start out with very simple things to help the lagoon and help the animals and plants that live here.
Yeah, I mean, we got contacted the other day by somebody who kind of wants to talk with us about tabletop composting and systems for that. And that's something that I did when I lived in Colorado, but didn't really have the mechanisms for when I lived in Kansas because they didn't have water. So composting gets very difficult when things can't break down. But I want to learn how to do it in my kitchen and then how to distribute that into the yard or dispose of it responsibly to reduce things like kitchen waste, which is, it can be impactful, if you add it up. So, I mean, there's sometimes criticism that, oh, does, X, Y, or Z, does that little thing really matter? And maybe it doesn't on an individual scale. If you're talking like statistically significant, but when you add it up to a neighborhood, to a community, to a city, to a region, it will. And that's really what we want to make a point of is that you as an individual can make a difference with just little small changes that hopefully don't require more time or money from you.
Uh-huh. And what's your sense of where the lagoon's at now?
I think coming off of 2024, we had a good year. We saw a lot of improvements. Mosquito Bay or Mosquito Lagoon is kind of the poster child for improvement that we had in 2024 with the seagrass and the fish and the water quality and things like that. There are lots of areas that need improvement. So I'm hoping that we're on the upslope of coming out of everything that happened, 2016 to 2020 with big blooms and die-offs and things like that. But there are concerns, Lake Okeechobee, increased activity at the Cape, new ports being built at Port Canaveral. So there's lots to stay vigilant about. But I'm hoping that we have good momentum to take the messages and the actions forward.
Right. And it's not really just one thing. You can't just solve this with a single answer.
Oh,
There's a
absolutely not.
bunch of different stuff we need
Hmm.
to be doing. And low impact living obviously is one that we as individuals can do to help impact and improve the lagoon.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of other big projects all over the place that need to be done and more in the future, I'm sure. And as
Right.
you've talked about, ultimately, hopefully, we learn more from science
Hmm.
and have new ideas and new ways to solve some of these problems that maybe are more efficient or effective.
Yeah, I think there is so much to do on the science side for informing that we need to do to inform the decisions that we are making or need to make. There are a lot of things that we don't know about seagrass. I get questions asked all the time about where seagrass is and where seagrass isn't. And, there are a lot of questions on that. The role of manatees not just feeding on seagrass, but how do animals actually help distribute seagrass seeds? Like we see a lot of seeds go through the guts of birds and get distributed that way. Is that happening with animals with seagrasses? So I mean, there's so much of the research, the science side that we don't understand yet that will help us make better decisions going forward.
Well, fantastic. I want to thank you so much for joining us and thanks for all the work you're doing with MRC.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for coming by.
Thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, subscribe, and like Explore the IRL.